Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And today we are going to be coming at you with Week 5 quarterback rankings. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm excited this week to be checking out some of these players, honestly. We have a lot of movement, it feels like, at the quarterback position, even again. So overall, we're going to structure the way we talk about these guys a little bit differently. We're going to kind of fly through some of the guys that are more obvious and then try and get into some of the more questionable players or more start-sit decisions here. Starting off at number 1, we have Lamar against Cincinnati. Obviously, not a very good defense there. Lamar has been great. With Josh Allen kind of having 2 good games, 2 bad games. He literally was terrible last week, only 7 points. Kind of knocked him down off of that number 1 spot in favor of Lamar. But he does get Houston this week. I think Josh Allen right back up there. Hopefully it doesn't get completely out of hand in the way that it did last week in a negative way. And then like the other time he didn't score very much, it got way out of hand in favor of the Bills. So hopefully with Houston, they can keep the game relatively close and Josh Allen will be better this week. Going down to number 3, Jaden Daniels. It's just not somebody you're going to bench anymore. I think regardless of matchup, he's going to be in the top 5. And now we have him at 3. So maybe we could have put Love ahead of him against the Rams, especially coming off of that monster game he just had. But for now, we're going to have Daniels at 3.
Number 4, Jordan Love. Just great overall to have Jordan Love back for fantasy and real life purposes. Obviously, he put up 28 fantasy points last week. A lot of that was in the fourth quarter, but it was a great comeback. It was great to see him on the field. Jaden Reed looks great. We know Dobbs is reliable. Wicks is very underrated. Tucker Kraft is playing well. I know, losing Christian Watson is a big blow, but they've got a lot of good guys that can fill in. So I think with this game, he goes up against a very vulnerable Rams defense. So we could see him run up the score a little bit. My only fear is if they have a couple touchdowns on the ground early and they kind of just pound the rock. But I think they're going to let Love continue to get his footing under him. Number 5, CJ Stroud going up against Buffalo. Buffalo's a good defense, but I think with this game, like you talked about with Josh Allen, we could see a pretty high-scoring affair going back and forth. Stroud's been great. He's only had 1 bad game where he threw those 2 interceptions, but other than that, it's been very clean football. Number 6, Joe Burrow. We talked about him early in the year, about a buy low candidate. I think that window has officially closed. He goes up against Baltimore. Baltimore is very, very good against the run, but they can be had through the air. So another game that could be pretty high scoring, so high hopes for Burrow.
Yeah, despite what we saw with Josh Allen last week, right? I mean, the Baltimore completely stifled Allen. So hopefully that doesn't happen to Burrow this week, right? And that they are able to continue to throw the ball effectively against Baltimore, because going into that game, Baltimore was 32nd against quarterbacks. So hopefully that matchup doesn't end up being difficult for Burrow here this week. Going down to the next 3 here, we have our first major division in player here, Kyler Murray. And so I actually dropped him down to 11 in my rankings, and you have him up at 8, it looks like. So I think Purdy, we both have at 7. So Purdy should be 1 spot ahead of Kyler here. Against Arizona, I do think Purdy is kind of a set it and forget it start. You're not thinking about it too much. In our league, the guy that owns Purdy and Josh Allen also has Baker. So maybe that can be a little bit of a conversation, but I think against Arizona, Purdy is a locked starter here. And I mentioned it in the last video. Hopefully Brandon Ayuk can get this going this week, right? And get over 100 yards here, actually catch some of his targets, have a higher catch rate here in this game. With Kyler, he had a disappointing week and a good matchup last week against Washington. They just could not stay on the field. He didn't run hardly at all. They barely passed. So against San Francisco, much better defense. Fred Warner, I think, is going to play, or is he out? Do you know?
I don't know if anything's official yet.
So keep an eye on that, because if Warner doesn't play, maybe Kyler's a little bit better of a play here. But I do have Kyler ranked quite a bit lower this week. I am down on him quite a bit. I did mention him in the trade targets video that maybe the owner of Kyler feels better about him than he's actually been. But if he has another bad week this week, I think Kyler is going to start to fall similarly to Mahomes and Anthony Richardson, kind of out of the good graces that we had for these guys over the first couple weeks here. So Kyler, I would be very hesitant to start in a 1 quarterback league, and in 2 quarterback leagues, if you have Darnold, say, like even all the way down to 15, you have Baker, that's a decision I think you're going to be making. For right now, we'd still go Kyler, but that's something where the tide can be changing a little bit here. And then at number 9, you have him down to 11. I have him up at 8 against Pittsburgh. I do think Dak is kind of matchup proof. They like to throw the ball a lot. Their running game isn't really that established yet, and it's going to be really hard to run against Pittsburgh. So if they're going to be doing anything in this game, it's going to have to be through the air. Hopefully CeeDee Lamb and Ferguson continue to carry this offense through the air and help Dak continue to be a top 10 quarterback.
Yeah, and for me with Kyler, I mean, the first 3 games we saw him rush at least 5 times a game, put up, typical solid rushing yards. Last week he rushed like 1 time, and he gets Trey McBride back. So I would expect him to lean back on both of those 2 things, which I think is kind of driving this ranking dispute a little bit. And with Dak, for me, Pittsburgh's just such a good defense. But you're right, they're not going to run the ball effectively. I'm sure they'll still try to use Zeke a lot, and he's going to run into a wall because that's what they do. Moving on to number 10, we got Justin Fields. So Fields is the QB6 on the season thus far from a fantasy perspective. He threw for 312 yards last week with a passing touchdown. He had 2 rushing touchdowns. He only has 1 interception on the year. What we would typically expect to be a tough matchup against Dallas defense just isn't the case right now. Dallas defense is kind of a mess. We saw Daniel Jones put up almost 300 yards against them, and that's when Neighbors left the field early. With Fields, it still feels like there's a little bit left to be desired from a rushing perspective. I know he scored 2 on the ground, but I would like to see kind of some more zone read options and just really get him unleashed on the ground. Moving over to number 11, Baker Mayfield. You can't sit Baker right now in any format. He's rolling. Falcons are middle of the road matchup against the pass. Evans was back to his old self last week, which was great to see. Godwin's obviously been great. Trey Palmer stepped up. Cade Otton had a really good game with Jalen McMillan out last week, so you're definitely starting Baker. Number 12, Patrick Mahomes. Kind of say this tongue-in-cheek. I think it's time we start moving him down, maybe even a little bit more. Another so-so performance last week, kind of salvaged by that deep touchdown to Xavier Worthy. Now that Rashee Rice is out, that's a tough blow. You and I both expect them to make a trade for a receiver, but even if they do get that done this week, it's highly unlikely that they would be on the field. He has been consistent in the sense that he's scored between 13 and 16 fantasy points each week. So in Superflex, you likely took him in the first or early second round, so you're kind of have to be starting him unless you hit on, a late guy like Baker or something. But Saints are a pretty tough matchup against the pass, so I would kind of expect this one to be a little bit lower scoring. So in standard leagues, I would definitely be sitting Mahomes. But yeah, we'll see how this offense looks now that it's going to be redesigned more around Kelsey and Worthy.
Yeah, it's funny to have these 3 guys next to each other because it's like 2 guys we're very excited about and that are trending way up, and 1 guy that we are not excited about at all and is trending down. So, Fields, if you have Fields and you see this at rank 10 and you want to start him over Kyler, you want to start him over Burrow, I don't have a problem with that. Fields was literally quarterback 1 last week. We know his rushing upside, and they've seemed to have unlocked him in the passing game. He has been great with Pickens. He even started using Najee Harris, who had 50 receiving yards. I mean, I don't know. This feels like Fields is going to just continue to work in this role. If you have Fields, just ride him right now. Hopefully Wilson doesn't take this job from him. I don't think he necessarily will, but they did lose the game, and they might lose this game to Dallas. So, if he keeps losing, there is that factor. But while he's on the field, just continue to start him. Going down to number 13, we have Geno against the Giants. This is another one where, if you wanted to start Geno over Mahomes, I don't know that I'd blame you. I think that's totally fine. Geno just absolutely lit on fire his stats against the Lions this past week, right? He didn't throw for very many scores, right? It was like all Ken Walker on the ground scoring the touchdowns. So unfortunately, his ceiling wasn't a little bit higher in this game, but we saw career highs in attempts, completions, yards. So I think Geno against the Giants, they should be able to get it going and beat them pretty good. I do expect a bounce back performance from the Seahawks defense in this game as well. Going to 14, Anthony Richardson. This is if he plays. I think there's a little bit of concern that he might not play, but this is going to be one of the best matchups he gets against Jacksonville. So another guy that if he does play, and especially if Jonathan Taylor is out, right, they're going to have to lean on him a little bit more in the rushing game and through the air. He did link up with Pittman a couple times before he did go out. So I do think that if that connection starts getting going, that Richardson's ceiling as a passer, I should say even his floor as well, will be raised because Pittman was all but not involved through the first 3 weeks and then had a nice week 4. So hopefully we see Richardson and him get on the same page and get rolling. Number 15, we have Sam Darnold. This is 100% the matchup, right, against the Jets. very, very tough defense to go against. Obviously, you got Sauce Gardner kind of leading the charge through the air. So, Darnold would be in the top 10 if not for the matchup.
Yeah, and with Richardson, those two passes to Pittman were strikes. He looked really good on those.
Yeah.
It was a shame that he got banged up on that one rush, went off the field, and then as soon as he came back, they had him rush again, which led him to get more banged up. Maybe that's a play that you go to someone else like Jonathan Taylor there, but it is what it is. With Darnold, too, just a side note, if you are on the West Coast, that game is in, I want to say, is it either London or Germany, but it is a 6:30 a.m. kickoff, so make sure you set your lineups accordingly. Number 16, Deshaun Watson. This one is always going to feel gross. I know last week I had pushed him up quite a bit, and he was a disappointment, put up only 12 fantasy points against a bad Raiders defense. That deep touchdown to Amari Cooper getting called back definitely hurt in Cooper's weeks a lot, and it was a pretty bad penalty. I don't know if you saw this, but there was one play where it was so bad. It
was such a bad call. It literally cost one of our guys a week in our league, too. It's just like that play in particular, I just wish there was a way to overturn that sort of a terrible call, or just like, I don't get how they don't get together and pick up that flag, because it made no sense. I mean, it's just like he stepped through the pocket. The guy completely let him go. He had a free rush at him and he threw it down the field, took the hit even. And it was just like, where's the flag there? Where is the penalty?
Yeah, that was brutal, man. And I don't know if you saw the play where I think it was the right tackle seemed to kind of like let the defender through, which caused some commotion on the sidelines. We've talked about this with Watson kind of being more or less a cancer in the locker room, and maybe we're starting to see that on the field a little bit more. And I still think it's only a matter of time before he gets benched. He does have a good matchup against the Commanders this week, but maybe not as good as we would have thought, given how Washington played against Arizona last week.
The Browns are they're 1-3, and they're going to lose this game too. They're going to be 1-4. Like, we've been telling you to pick up Jameis Winston. There's not much more we can do at this point to continue to tell you to pick up Winston if you're in a deep superflex league that lets you add players like that, right? That doesn't have a cap on your quarterback situation. I just think it's like almost a must at this point to get him on your team, especially if you have Watson.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you have Watson, 100%, you have to make that a thing. Yeah. And moving over to number 17, Andy Dalton. He is at Chicago this week. He had a decent game against the Bengals, putting up 15 fantasy points, not as high as we would have hoped for. Their offensive line has been really good all year, which is kind of a testament to how bad Bryce Young actually was. It was really good to see Xavier Legette take a step forward. I know you and I talked about him last week in our Beat the Waiver Wire episode, so hopefully those of you who were listening got him before to the wire this week. But this is a tough matchup against the Bears. Bears are a top 10 defense against the pass. So I'm, sitting him if you can. I have him in a league, and I'm starting, Geno and Fields over him, but I'm, happy about him long term. The other guy in this game, Caleb Williams, coming in at number 18. Very disappointing week against the Rams. He threw for only 157 yards and one touchdown after throwing for 363 yards the week before. Panthers are much better against the pass than they are against the run, but their defense is not like it's that great overall. He's obviously very talented. He's got great weapons, but we need to see better offensive play calling. I do think if they can win the next couple games, they've got Carolina, they've got Jacksonville, and then they go on a bye. So I think you can probably count on them more a little bit in the second half. Hopefully they kind of get things turned around with that bye week. So long-term optimistic. Don't cut him in Superflex because you don't want to have someone else have him if he does have a second half turnaround.
Yeah, the frustrating thing with Caleb in this game too is like DJ Moore was wide open for a 20-yard touchdown, and he just launched it past him. I don't even understand the throw. It was like a Anthony Richardson-esque throw where it's just like, oh my God, he's wide open, and he just like threw it as hard as he could at him. It's like, dude, just throw it up there and lead him. He's wide open. So, obviously leaves some to be desired there, but I do think we're seeing a little bit of improvement, and obviously they were able to lean on the ground in this game. The Rams could not stop DeAndre Swift. They were throwing screens.
The Rams are so bad against the run.
It's crazy how they're terrible against the pass and they're terrible against the run. So like the Bears just really controlled the clock in this game, and that's why Caleb didn't have as good of an outcome here. They were winning the whole time, so better days ahead for Caleb. I'm going down to 19. We have Daniel Jones. I actually dropped him in the rankings from the time we made this slide, so I do think he's a little bit lower now. Disappointing game, plus Seattle, I think, has a really good defense in secondary. Malik Neighbors is a question mark right now, so until we get confirmation that Neighbors is going to play, I just hesitate to even consider Jones a starter. Going to number 20, Trevor Lawrence. We both don't particularly like him, but against Indy, this is going to be one of his easier matchups. I do think they've kind of figured out their identity in the passing game, which has helped them a lot over the last 2 weeks. It's Brian Thomas Jr. down the field, and it's Christian Kirk close. I don't know what happened the first 2 weeks when they weren't throwing it to Kirk at all, but he has 8 catches and 7 catches in the last 2 games. Very much involved, very big part of the offense now, Christian Kirk is. So I think they kind of figured that out. Once they get Evan Ingram back, I think he gets feathered in as well. Travis Etienne doesn't look like he's very much part of the game plan. I know he got banged up and hurt, but in the passing game, he hasn't really done too much to this point. So I do think Lawrence could be trending up here in a way that I hate to admit, but he was QB 15 last week. And he's QB 15-ish on the whole season. So, he has been kind of hanging around since the quarterback play has been so bad. So look for T-Law to have a better game this week against Indy. So Kirk Cousins here against Tampa Bay pushed him up a little bit higher maybe than he's been. He did have a disappointing week again last week. Hasn't been throwing very many touchdowns. So I hope that the offense can kind of figure out a way to score more through the air. But against Tampa Bay, they should be down. This should be a game where they're having to pass to catch up. Bijan Robinson is banged up on a short week. So we'll see how that ends up playing out in the backfield. Maybe they turn it over to Algier a little bit more. But overall, he could have a little bit more of a breakout game than what we've seen so far this year.
Yeah, and just to add on Daniel Jones, if Malik Neighbors does not clear protocol, please do not start Daniel Jones, because a lot of that underneath stuff that was open for Wandale, that's a byproduct of the defensive having to focus on Malik Neighbors. And so I think this offense is just going to completely fall apart without him. So keep a close eye on that. They did have those 3 extra days, so there is a better chance that he plays, but just make sure you're on top of that. And I think with Lawrence too, like you mentioned, with Evan Ingram back is kind of his safety blanket. They need to get what's his name, number 0 off the field, Gabe Davis. I don't know why they signed him in the first place, but Brian Thomas is a superstar. And I was texting you the other day just talking about how good this wide receiver class has been and really living up to that expectation. So I think Brian Thomas just looks like unguardable sometimes, and it's good to see him getting even more involved.
I think they signed Gabe Davis too because they were anticipating Brian Thomas needing more time. That's the only explanation I can think of, right? That Gabe Davis was going to play that role until Brian Thomas was ready, and Brian Thomas was ready in week 1, and they didn't necessarily anticipate that. They didn't turn over the keys fully, even though Brian Thomas had been pretty productive through the first couple of weeks. This week, they turned the keys over to him fully. Gabe only had 3 targets, didn't have a catch. And Brian Thomas had 9 targets and 6 catches, 86 yards and a touchdown. That change of the guard has officially happened. Brian Thomas is going to be awesome.
Yeah, and if you think that, just a side note, if you think Brian Kelly is a good college football coach and he lost games with Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Jaden Daniels, I don't know how bad you have to be defensively to lose any games with those 3. I don't think it's quite the echelon of, the Burrow, Chase, and Jefferson tier, but it's looking maybe pretty close. So I don't know what's going on over there. Their fans must be kicking themselves for not being able to make it into the playoff last year. But, moving over
it's looking like they at least should have won more games.
Right. They were right. Those guys are just, it's unbelievable, man.
Like Kingsbury-esque when he had Mahomes,
Yeah, it's come on, how much more do you possibly need? And they had a great offensive line too, so I don't know, whatever. Number 22, Matt Stafford. You just can't start Stafford really unless you're in a pinch until he gets his weapons back. I know in our league I went 0 QB and I took him as my first QB off the board, but it was able to pick up Fields and Andy Dalton to kind of cover my tracks alongside Geno Smith. Even in that ridiculous comeback win against the Niners, he still only put up 12 fantasy points, which just kind of separates real life quarterback play from fantasy play. And, you and I both think that Stafford's a great real life quarterback. but I would not recommend cutting him in Superflex. I know he's got a tough matchup against Green Bay. I think they've got a bye coming back too. But once he gets his weapons back for the second half of the year, I think he's someone that could be a plug-and-play starter, assuming you don't have better options. Number 23, Derek Carr. He is at Kansas City this week, back-to-back weeks scoring under 10 fantasy points after that blazing start. He threw it 36 times against the Falcons, but only 239 yards and an interception. Chiefs aren't great against the pass, but I feel like they're always good at game planning for certain things. So it'll be interesting to see if they focus a little bit more on shutting down Olave or Shaheed. But I think he's going to need kind of one of those vintage Shaheed plays, and then hope that Taysom Hill doesn't just get the goal line carries. Maybe he can throw one in the red zone, but kind of a tough matchup for Carr this week. Aaron Rodgers, another tough matchup. He's at Minnesota, or technically he's not at Minnesota. He's at London, but Minnesota is such a good defense. They've been shutting down everyone, except for that fourth quarter against Green Bay. But we see that sometimes where the defense just gets gassed. Jordan Love was on an absolute heater. So this is another really tough matchup. I do hope they will kind of look at the tape and try to get Garrett Wilson more involved. I know Alan Lazard has been kind of a fantasy surprise. Conklin's been playing well. Breece Hall's kind of stunk, but I think they kind of need a game plan to get their playmaker the ball a little bit more. I think Rodgers was probably a little bit pissed at him for fumbling the ball. We know how moody he can be. Obviously, it was a tough game in the rain, but I'm not starting him if I don't have to this week.
So I think with Rodgers, I moved him up a little bit. Also, just because I think after seeing Minnesota struggle a little bit against Jordan Love late, I'm hoping that, like you said, they can apply some of what they saw to try and get going early on offense. And I do hope that Garrett Wilson can kind of, not facing a difficult corner necessarily in this matchup, can get going. I hope that they get him the ball more. I just can't believe that they went from what they had at quarterback to Aaron Rodgers, and Garrett Wilson has gotten this much worse. I mean, I just almost wish he just was what he was last year. And it's hard to deal with as a Garrett Wilson owner. So I do have a little bit of hope that we see a little bit of a heartbeat go here. And then also there's a chance too that Devontae ends up here by the time you're listening to this. So if Devontae Adams is on the team and ends up being active for this game, I do think that additionally can push Rodgers up further. With Jacoby Brissett, you're not playing Jacoby Brissett ideally unless you're in a major pinch. They are playing Miami, and we just saw the Titans kind of give it to Miami. The Titans did just run the ball a ton and throw to their backs. So that was kind of how they ended up winning, and maybe that's a good thing for Ramondre Stevenson. But hopefully Jacoby can put together a decent stat line. Maybe he throws a touchdown in this one if you do need him in a pinch. Tyler Huntley, for as bad as he looked as a quarterback in his first start with Miami, he did finish as quarterback 19 on the week last week. So, against New England, second start, maybe gets a little bit more rushing going, maybe hits one of those 3 balls to Tyreek Hill that he missed all of them. That would have been touchdowns, right? I mean, it's just brutal to see Tyreek Hill streaking down the field and just doesn't get the ball because it's not on time and in the right location. So hopefully he can maybe hit on one of those, and maybe Tyreek Hill doesn't, they don't do an illegal formation where Tyreek Hill got called back on a 22-yard play. Waddle had a 20-yard play called back on a penalty. So there is some additional upside here. Hopefully he kind of gets his bearings and shows out a little bit better this week. 27, Gardner Minshew at Denver, who just completely shut down Rodgers and the Jets. Obviously, it was in the rain, so a little bit different setup here, but Devontae Adams is obviously not going to play for the Raiders in this game, so I don't think that there's a lot of upside here with Jacoby Myers going to go up against Surtain. That's going to be a nightmare matchup for him. You're not starting Myers anywhere. You're not starting any number 1 wide receiver against Denver, but especially not Jacoby Myers. And so, maybe Brock Bowers gets going here, but tough game for Minshew. And then Bo Nix. Last guy here, I actually did push Bo Nix up quite a bit in my rankings. My initial ranking, I had him at 28 just by default, but I did push him up to 21 because I think there's a decent chance, I think, against the Raiders that they have more room to operate than they did against the Jets last week. And Nix hopefully can get Sutton going. And if he can get Cortland Sutton going in this game, 9 targets last week for Sutton, only 3 catches. If he does get 10, 11, 12 targets this week and gets up to, 8 catches, 100 yards, maybe a touchdown, I think that's something in the passing game that can really get the Broncos offense going and possibly be a good thing for Bucs.
Yeah, I think to add with Minshew, I don't think he's someone that necessarily needs to be rostered on Superflex teams. They've got Denver this week. They've got the Steelers next week. So I would imagine that they're going to lose both of those games and that they're going to turn it over to Aiden O'Connell. The season's already over now that Devontae Adams wants out. So he's not someone I would be even wasting a roster spot on at this point. And with Bo Nix, good for him. He threw his first touchdown pass last week. It was one of his 60 yards. And I think with him, we have seen him run a little bit. So I do think in an easy matchup against Las Vegas, I need to let my foot off the gas of the Bo Nix hate just a little bit, but he's not someone that I would be comfortably starting. But if you've got, Jared Goff or another guy on bye, maybe you have Jalen Hurts or something, and you're stressing at Superflex, I think you could do worse. And by worse, I mean Gardner Minshew.
Yeah, yeah, right. All right. If you want our full ranking set, comments rankings down below. We look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.